I just want to start by saying how blown away I was this morning when I accidentally ended up hitching my wagon to your tour. I mean, what an unbelievable site you have. So I'm feeling really inspired. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you on a bit of the journey that we've been on. And I just pressed one of these buttons, I assume.
The forward.
Okay, good. Oh, there it is. Well, boy, I need glasses. All right. First, a little bit about the past, since we've talked quite a bit about the past here. The Presidio is a really unique among national park sites in that it has a very long human history that goes all the way up to the moment that it transferred from the Army into the national park system. It's a site that we know was used, it was the ancestral home of the Muwekma people. We have a village site, burial site, and a series of shell mounds that we know are scattered along the northern edge. And in 1776, the Spanish founded a garrison, or Presidio, which was the northern end of the Spanish Empire. Thus began about 220 years of military use of the site under 3 flags. And it was the command, so many of the bases along the west coast reported into the administration of the Presidio, and that left not only a really interesting and complicated military history, but also a really important architectural legacy. In 1962, while it was still an active duty base, the whole base was declared to be a National Historic Landmark District. We have about 470 historic buildings, about 1,200 historic features, including a 300-acre historic forest and a Golden Gate Bridge. It also is a biodiversity hotspot. As you know, the Army is a great conservation institution in America, preserves a lot of amazing sites, and in fact, the Presidio has the greatest density on a per acre basis of special status plant species of any national park in America, which is a little hard to imagine given that the entire site was developed. We have 22 special status plant species growing in the Presidio, which is really amazing. 6 of them are endangered and exist nowhere else on Earth. It's also interesting among Army bases in that the site was always an open Army base. So back even in the 19th century, the public was using the Presidio as a park. So I remember when I was a boy, you'd come in through the gates, the MPs would greet you with rifles. If you didn't look shady, they'd let you in. And you got to enjoy this incredible landscape. And I actually think it's one of the critical reasons that when the Golden Gate National Recreation Area was created in 1972, that Congressman Phil Burton drew a line around the Presidio, sort of snuck this into the legislation, drew a line around the Presidio and said that if the land was ever declared to be surplus by the Army, that it would automatically transfer to the National Park Service. So as a result, this site automatically became state federal land, automatically shifted to the National Park Service, and never shifted over to the local jurisdiction. And so as a result, we have enjoyed a really critical and interesting and important degree of autonomy over the last 25 years. But as you can see, this is an aerial photo of the Presidio. It's about 2.5 square miles. This doesn't really look like most national parks. In fact, it's much more like a small town in a park in a metropolis. We have about 6 million square feet of buildings, about 800 buildings. As I mentioned earlier, 470 of those are historically 30 miles of a road. I have 40 miles of sidewalk. I have a water treatment plant. I have a police department. I have a fire department. I have 5 schools. It's pretty much 5 playing fields, you name it, I've got it. It's pretty much a small town with all of the attendant challenges that you find in redeveloping very old small towns, which is what this was. Now the big problem we faced was this, that the Army, for a couple of decades, mostly because it was declared a National Historic Landmark District, starting in the 60s, began systematically underinvesting in this site. And as a result, when the land came to the National Park Service in 1994, they did a study to determine exactly what it would take to restore the Presidio and to maintain it. And at that time, in 94, they determined it would cost about $750 million to restore the Presidio. That's a bargain, let me tell you, relative to what we have spent, which we'll talk about in a minute. But at that time, that would have increased the deferred maintenance backlog in the entire national park system in America by 50%. Similarly, at that time, they did a study of what it would cost to operate the Presidio. It was about $45 million a year. That was more than Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand Canyon combined. And so the challenge of restoring it and the challenge of operating it on an ongoing basis resulted in two things. First, well, how do I say this in a short way? Congress almost deauthorized the Presidio. That's the easy way to say it. They almost deauthorized the Presidio and sold the land. It came within about 35 votes of passing in the House of Representatives because the land was so valuable and it was going to be so expensive. There was a thought that maybe we'd sell the Presidio and pay down the national debt. So that was the thought. The thought almost happened. There was a counter thought, because it didn't, and that was, let's use this as an opportunity to reimagine government. Let's ask ourselves whether or not we can reimagine government for the 21st century as a government that is able to marshal the best of the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to create a new kind of federal agency and new kinds of partnerships that we can use to manage complicated sites like the Presidio. It's not really, it's one part park, one part community, one part redevelopment. So Congress created a really unusual partnership when they created the Presidio Trust, and they set us to work, working with the National Park Service and also with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, our nonprofit partner. I've had the good fortune to work for all three organizations, and there are many of us that move back and forth from organization to organization, which is part of the secret sauce that has made our partnership so successful. So just a bit about the trust. We are a single-purpose federal agency. We exist for one reason, and that is to preserve the Presidio. We were given an array of special authorities. We can retain revenues, we can enter into lease agreements. We are not civil servants. We're all at-will employees, so we can hire and fire at will. We were given exemption from a lot of arcane federal procurement laws. For those of you who have never worked for the federal government, there is nothing worse than trying to buy anything if you're a federal employee. We were unfortunately not given the ability to raise capital, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of the big mistakes in our legislation is that. But the kicker is we were given 15 years to reach financial self-sufficiency, or the site would be sold and developed. So that was the big compromise. We were given a declining federal appropriation. Our first year it was $24 million, and it dropped down to about $12 million in year 15. And then in year 16 dropped to zero. And if we could credibly argue that we had achieved financial self-sufficiency, as I mentioned earlier, the site was going to be transferred to GAO, sold, or GSA, sold, and then developed as a part of the fabric of San Francisco. So how did we do it? How did we get, because you know the punchline, we made it, the site didn't get sold. So how did we do it? I would say there are really three primary strategies that we used. The first was the most critical, which is really saving the place. And there are a couple of different strategies we used to do that. The first was we very quickly came to realize that the most important thing we needed to do was to fill the place with people. As I mentioned earlier, the site was a former Army base. When you drive up to the Presidio, it feels like a country club with gates and walls. Those gates and walls had been used to, you were greeted by MPs when you walked up to those gates and walls. And so what we realized is we very quickly had to rebuild the Presidio community. We had to take those 1,500 housing units that were sitting there looking all, let me go back, like that, and turn them into that. And there were two reasons. The first is the Presidio did not feel comfortable. It didn't feel welcoming. It felt, frankly, felt haunted, and it felt empty. And we needed it to feel like this. We needed it to feel welcome. We needed it to feel activated and alive. And we also needed to establish a 24-hour presence in the park so that it didn't feel unused in the middle of the night. And we needed to create a really solid economic engine. And so housing proved to be the magic, kind of the magic solution to that, all of those problems. And it has worked really well. The second thing that we did, because we were unable to borrow, is we had to partner with third parties. We would offer them through a series of ground leases to capital-rich individuals that came onto the site and were able to take on some of the big projects that we simply could not raise enough revenue to fund. So this is one of those examples. This is the former Public Health Service hospital. This is the before, and this is the after. We partnered with Forest City. They were willing to invest about $180 million, money it would have taken us decades to raise at the rate that we were raising, generating revenue. convert this building into 180 units, beautiful apartments. As you can see, took off the 1950s non-historic wings and restored the original historic facade. And did this in a way that allowed this whole neighborhood to be a model of green development. In fact, this was the first LEED ND certified neighborhood in America. This model of leveraging using a small private investment to leverage a significant private sector investment, I mean public to private, got it, is another piece of the secret sauce that has allowed us to succeed. And in fact, to date, we've rehabilitated about 4.5 million square feet of the 6 million that we have in the Presidio. To do that, we've leveraged about $300 million of public investment to secure about $1.5 billion of private investment. And what that's allowed us to do is create an economic engine that each year kicks off about $140 million. And that $140 million both supports the park and then also is reinvested because we've, as you can tell, have about $1.5 million of real estate left that we need to rehabilitate and reuse. And we also have about 50% of the park left to restore. So we've got quite a bit of work left before us. And so we need to continue to generate more revenue, to kick off net operating income each year so that we can continue the transformation of the Presidio into a really vibrant public place. The other really critical thing that we saved was the history of the site. And I can't emphasize enough, we've heard a lot about history. History is so vitally important. Understanding the place, understanding the popular psyche, and the role that a place occupies in the popular imagination is vitally important. And capturing those stories while people are still alive. We've heard the word endurance. I guess I'm here to tell you that projects like this are a marathon, they're not a sprint. And as you know, we've been at this for about 28 years. And it's vitally important early in the process to capture those memories and that sense of what a place is and how it reflects the popular imagination. It's also important to tell the hard stories. This is an example of an exhibit we have called Exclusion. One of the many dark underbelly stories of the Presidio has to do with the Japanese-American internment during the Second World War. The order for that was actually issued from the Presidio about 500 feet away from a Japanese-American language school where Japanese Americans were cracking Japanese codes and supporting the war effort. Their families, the order that allowed their families to be interned was issued. And so how did people at that time think about that? How did those Japanese-American soldiers feel about the fact that the army that they were supporting was actually interning their families? And how do we think about that in a contemporary sense? So use history as a way to both talk about and connect to community, but also use it as a way to heal the past and be honest, have an honest conversation about our history, which, let's face it, some of our history is pretty dark. But also use history as a way to help young people feel connected to a place. And so we use history as a really important vehicle for connecting by creating relevant stories, telling relevant stories that allow young people in particular to connect to this place. So the second strategy has to do with healing the site. This is really about the natural systems in the Presidio and also being good environmental stewards of the place. We developed an integrated green master plan really early on that looked at the whole site, even though it's historic, through an ecological lens. Developed a community partner-based approach that's really about engaging our community, citizens across the community in the restoration of the place, and also building a kind of an informed constituency for the natural resources, which were largely unknown in the broader community. We focused a lot on those relic natural systems, restoring them. We created a really big remediation program. I'm happy to hear someone said earlier that it all got rinsed away here. Boy, that is a blessing, let me tell you. Ours didn't get rinsed away. The Army gave us $100 million to clean up the site, and we spent about a decade removing over 1,000 contaminated sites, including 13 landfills, and using those as a vehicle to do habitat restoration work throughout the site. And in the course of all that, we've been able to double the acreage of natural area in the post from 100 acres to 220. We've implemented a whole series of sustainable strategies, because part of what is so beautiful about these kinds of places is that it's important to take the long view. And sustainability makes an enormous amount of sense when you're going to be stewarding a place in perpetuity. and engage the community in such a way that each year we get an extraordinary amount of support. Last year we had about 6,000 volunteers that worked in the park and contributed about 70,000 hours taking care of this place, which is really, really essential. Last but not least, we've really focused on welcoming the community. I talked a little bit about the fact that the Presidio was walled. It was perceived, a place that was really perceived to be for others. It's surrounded by not only a physical wall, but also a wall of wealth, because the Presidio is surrounded by all of the wealthiest neighborhoods in San Francisco. And one of the big barriers is really perceptual. How do you take a place like the Presidio and make it a national park for everyone when it's surrounded not only by this physical wall, but also by this wall of wealth? And so we've engaged in a whole variety of strategies to make sure that the Presidio really functions as an open platform where people from across the Bay Area community, which is extraordinarily diverse, feel really welcome and feel as though they a sense of ownership that the Presidio is theirs. And we've done this both through the physical transformation of the place by restoring historic features like the main parade, which looked like this at base closure, into a new community commons, where every weekend thousands of members of the public come and bring community performances, community dance performances, and a large community picnic. We raised $30 million working with the Conservancy to create a comprehensive system of 24 miles of trail and 19 miles of bikeway that stitched this landscape that wasn't designed to be a public place together. And I'm so excited to see your plans about building this trail network, because the most fundamental thing you need to do to sites like this is just open them up and welcome the public in. And so by creating a system of trails that leverages the drama of the site, you know, we did that in the Presidio. 5 million people a year use our trails. I mean, it's the simplest thing, and it's the most important thing. So I'm just delighted to see that that's on your radar screen. We partnered with the private sector to create a recreational precinct using some of our buildings so that when the weather is bad, people can come and enjoy this place so that they begin to associate the Presidio with fitness and with wellness. We also established an Art About Place program. One of the big challenges with telling the story of a complicated multi-dimensional site like this or like the Presidio is that words aren't enough. And so artists are some of the best ways that we found that we can tell the story of a multi-dimensional place like this. And this is a work by the artist Andy Goldsworthy, but we have an ongoing Art About Place program that helps the community connect to the Presidio in new and unique ways. We also are always interested in overcoming some of the key barriers that we've heard about. And one of the key barriers we've heard about, for example, is transit and access. And we heard a little bit about access earlier. Again, like so many things we do, this is really about adopting a leveraging strategy. So we charge for parking, and with that we provide free transit. And this is another one of those examples of ways in which we're a little bit like Robin Hood. We ask the market, because we're surrounded by such a wealthy neighborhood, and because we're surrounded, we have such beautiful views, and the site has the capacity to generate quite a bit of revenue. We use that to make sure that individuals in our community that don't have the resources to come, that don't have the resources to drive, have free options and can get to the park to make sure it really does become a park for everyone. We've also worked with 22 organizations across town to create something called the Park Youth Collaborative. Again, leveraging the resources of organizations whose core mission is serving young people and serving the community through program, leveraging their expertise and experience to really activate the place. Our core mission is not delivering program. Our core mission is stewarding the place. But the best thing that we can do is partner with organizations whose core mission is engaging the community and activating places through program, and invite them in and let them bring their experiences to the park and activate it for us. And lastly, we're working on a couple of really important, large philanthropic, boy, it's the afternoon or the sugar is wearing off, I'm telling you. A couple of really important philanthropic projects. Probably the most important one is the Presidio Tunnel Tops project, which is really about healing a wrong that was imposed on our site when the Golden Gate Bridge was built and the Presidio was split in two by the highway approach to the Golden Gate Bridge. This is a 25-acre project that is going to be 25 acres of new park that is built over the freeway, that is going to connect the two halves of the park, Chrissy Field and the heart of the Post, with new tunnel top parklands, a new visitor gateway, and also a new youth campus that will allow us to increase the number of young people we serve each year from 30,000 to over 100,000. This project would not have been possible 20 years ago. But because of the work that we have done with the community, because of our track record as an organization that has gradually and incrementally transformed this place and built a really solid financial future for the Presidio, we've been able to raise $98 million in the surrounding community to build this 25-acre new park, something that we could have never done in our early days. So reflecting on the day, I just want to just reflect back to you a couple of the really important lessons that I've learned in the work that we've done in the Presidio. I mentioned the first a few minutes ago, which is taking a place as multidimensional as this, or a place as the Presidio, and transforming them into things that are relevant to the community. It really is a marathon, and you're just at the beginning of that. We're in the middle of that, but I think of us as only in the middle, because I think making places like this takes decades. And so I really encourage you to take the long view, which it sounds like you are, which is really heartening to me. The second thing is that I have found that it's vitally important to make historic places relevant to today. That the most important thing we can do to preserve the past is to make it relevant to contemporary audiences. And I've seen this, I've traveled a lot around the world and looked at vibrant historic places, and the one ingredient that's true is that they not only honor the past, but they do it in a way that is about embracing the future. And I think the last thing is, earlier we heard the word catalytic, and I think that is so important, that a project like this can really be a catalyst that allows this community to embrace the future of this community and guide the future of this community. It is such an extraordinary sight. I mean, I've never been in this part of Oregon before, and when I walked out on that trail this morning, and I stood there looking over at those falls, I mean, that is the most powerful sight. And if you can capture the power of that site and leverage it and use it as a catalyst to embrace the future and think about, what is this place going to be in 50 years? What are your grandchildren and great-grandchildren going to look back on and say, that was the best damn decision that you made to do X? However you answer that question, it's just a really exciting, transformative opportunity you have. So I just wish you the best of luck. I think it's an extraordinary, extraordinary place. Thank you.